Elvis Presley walked into a place where nobody cared about his fame, and it nearly destroyed him. Now, before we get into one of the most powerful untold stories in music history, if you're the kind of person who loves the real stories behind the legends, the ones they never taught you in school, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming on this channel. All right, let's go back. Memphis, Tennessee, late 1950s. The city was electric and divided. You had Beale Street pumping out blues and gospel and soul music so raw it could make a grown man weep. You had white neighborhoods where people locked their doors at sundown and turned the radio dial away from anything that sounded too black. And right in the middle of all that tension, all that beauty, all that ugliness, you had Elvis Aaron Presley. By this point, Elvis was already the most famous entertainer on the planet. His hips had scandalized television. His voice had rewritten the rules of popular music. Teenage girls fainted at his concerts. Preachers condemned him from pulpits. Politicians warned parents he was corrupting the youth of America. But here's what most people didn't know about Elvis. Behind the sequin jumpsuits, behind the sneering lip and the swagger, behind every screaming arena and magazine cover, there was a kid from Tupelo, Mississippi, who grew up so poor his family sometimes went to bed hungry. A kid who learned to sing not from a vocal coach or a record producer, but from sitting in church pews beside his mother, Gladys, listening to hymns that made poverty feel survivable for a few precious minutes. Elvis didn't discover music in a recording studio. He discovered it in the church, and not just any church. See, this is the part of the Elvis story that gets quietly skipped over in most documentaries. Growing up in Tupelo and later in Memphis, Elvis didn't just attend white churches. He was drawn, magnetically, irresistibly drawn to the black churches in his community. The Pentecostal congregations, the gospel choirs, the places where worship wasn't polite and rehearsed. It was fire, it was sweat. It was people throwing their whole bodies and voices toward heaven because they had nowhere else to throw them. Young Elvis would slip into the back rows or stand outside the windows and just listen. He absorbed everything, the call and response, the way a voice could bend a note until it carried the weight of 100 years of suffering, the way music could turn a room full of exhausted, beaten-down people into something that felt, for just a moment, invincible. That sound carved itself into his bones. And years later, when Elvis Presley opened his mouth on a stage in front of millions, what came out was a voice shaped by those churches, shaped by black gospel, shaped by something he loved more deeply than anything fame ever gave him. But loving something and being welcomed into it, those are two very different things. Now, the exact details of this story have been told in different ways over the years. Some accounts place it at East Trigg Baptist Church in Memphis. Others mention different congregations. The specific names and dates shift depending on who's telling it. But the core of the story, what witnesses described, what people who knew Elvis confirmed again and again, that part stays remarkably consistent. So here's what happened. Elvis, at the height of his early fame, received an invitation. Or maybe he invited himself. Or maybe it was somewhere in between, a door that cracked open just enough for a curious, conflicted young white man to walk through. He entered a black church in Memphis. Now you have to understand what that meant in the 1950s South. This wasn't like showing up to a concert venue. This wasn't a publicity stunt. Memphis in the 50s was a city carved in half by segregation. There were white water fountains and black water fountains, white lunch counters and black lunch counters, white neighborhoods where black people weren't welcome after dark, and black neighborhoods where white people almost never set foot unless they were there to cause trouble. For Elvis Presley to walk into a black church, willingly, without cameras, without a press team, was an act that could have ended his career. His white fan base could have turned on him overnight. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, would have had a heart attack if he'd known. The whole machinery of Elvis's fame was built on appealing to white America, and white America in the 1950s was not ready for this. But Elvis went anyway. Why? Because something inside him was starving, and the food he needed couldn't be found on any stage in America. A Sunday morning, the kind of Memphis morning where the air hangs thick and warm, heavy with humidity and the distant sound of church bells. Inside the sanctuary, the congregation was already seated. Families in their Sunday best, women in hats and gloves, men in pressed suits despite the heat, children fidgeting in the pews while their mothers gave them the look, the look, the one that could freeze a child mid-squirm from 40 feet away. The choir had already begun warming the room. Voices layered over voices, harmonies stacking like thunderclouds building before a storm. A Hammond organ hummed underneath everything, holding the whole thing together like a heartbeat. And then Elvis Presley walked through the door. The reaction wasn't screaming. It wasn't fainting or reaching or grabbing at his clothes. It was something far more terrifying. Silence. Not complete silence. The choir kept singing, the organ kept playing, but a human silence. The silence of 400 pairs of eyes landing on a single person and making a judgment in real time. Who is he? Why is he here? What does he want from us? Because let's be honest about the context. By 1957, Black America had every reason to be suspicious of Elvis Presley. Here was a white man who had taken the sounds of their community, the rhythms, the vocal techniques, the raw emotional delivery that came from centuries of Black worship and Black suffering, and turned it into a career that made him richer and more famous than any Black artist could dream of being. Black musicians like Big Mama Thornton had recorded Hound Dog before Elvis ever touched it. Black gospel quartets had been singing with the fire and physicality that Elvis became famous for long before he was born. And yet it was Elvis who got the record deals, the movie contracts, the screaming white audiences, the spot on Ed Sullivan. So when he walked into that church, he wasn't just walking into a building. He was walking into a room full of people who had been watching white America borrow from their culture for generations, usually without credit, without respect, without even acknowledgement. Some people in those pews looked at him with open hostility, some with guarded curiosity, some, maybe a few, with the quiet grace that church teaches even when the world gives you every reason to withhold it. Elvis felt all of it. He didn't walk to the front, he didn't announce himself. He found a seat, some say near the back, others say toward the middle, and he sat down, quietly, hands on his knees, head slightly bowed. Like a man entering somebody else's house, and knowing he hadn't earned the right to be there yet. The service continued, and this is where something began to shift. The choir sang, and when a Black gospel choir in Memphis in the 1950s sang, it wasn't performance. It was an event. It was spiritual weather. Voices didn't just fill the room, they rearranged it. They pulled emotion up from the floorboards. They shook the rafters and the ribs of every person sitting in those pews. And Elvis, the biggest star in the world, the man who had performed for presidents and packed stadiums, sat there with tears rolling down his face. Not polite tears, not celebrity tears carefully dabbed with a monogrammed handkerchief. Real tears, the kind that come from a place so deep you didn't even know it was still there. Because this was the music that made him. This was the sound he had chased his entire life. And hearing it here in its original home, sung by the people who created it, for the reasons it was actually created, not for money, not for fame, but for God, for survival, for the desperate human need to feel less alone. It broke something open inside him. Witnesses later described Elvis as looking like a completely different person during that service. Not the sneering, hip-swinging provocateur, not the movie star, not the icon. Just a kid from Tupelo who missed his mother's voice. Now here's where the story gets really interesting. At some point during the service, and again, the details vary depending on who's telling it, Elvis was acknowledged. Maybe someone invited him to speak. Maybe the pastor said a word. Maybe the choir director, recognizing who was sitting in their church, extended an invitation that nobody expected. Would you like to sing? Imagine being Elvis in that moment. Imagine the weight of that question. This wasn't a concert hall where people paid to adore you. This was sacred ground. These were people who could see through performance the way a surgeon sees through skin. If you were fake, they would know instantly, and they would not be kind about it. Every instinct probably told him to decline, to stay seated, to keep his head down and just be grateful he was allowed to sit there. But Elvis stood up. He walked to the front of the church, and he opened his mouth. What came out wasn't Hound Dog. It wasn't Heartbreak Hotel. It wasn't any of the songs that had made him millions. He sang gospel. He sang the music he had first fallen in love with as a barefoot boy in Mississippi. He sang it without the band, without the backup singers, without the pyrotechnics of a stadium show. Just his voice, raw and trembling and utterly exposed. And something in that room changed. People who had walked in ready to judge him felt their defenses crack. Not because Elvis was the greatest gospel singer they'd ever heard. he wasn't. There were voices in that choir that could have leveled mountains, but because he sang with something that cannot be faked. Desperation, honesty, the sound of a man not performing for an audience, but reaching towards something he was terrified he'd lost. An older woman in the congregation later told her family, "That white boy sang like he was trying to get back home." And maybe that's exactly what he was doing. When the song ended, the church didn't erupt into a standing ovation. This wasn't a concert. What happened was quieter and more powerful. People nodded, some wiped their eyes. A few said amen, not loudly but meaningfully. One older man reached out and shook Elvis's hand without saying a word, and that handshake carried more weight than any award Elvis would ever receive. Because in that moment, something that almost never happened in 1950s America took place. A room full of black people and one white man shared something real. Not political, not performative, not calculated for cameras or newspapers. Just human. And that's what left Elvis speechless. Not the music, not the hospitality, not even the forgiveness he may or may not have deserved. What left him speechless was the realization that everything he had built, the fame, the career, the legend, was a pale shadow of what he had just experienced. The real thing. The original fire. The music in its purest form, sung by the people who created it in the place where it was born. Elvis walked out of that church a different man. Not visibly. He still wore the same clothes. He still drove the same car. He still went back to Graceland and back to the stage and back to the machinery of fame. But inside, something had permanently shifted. People close to Elvis later said that he talked about black gospel music for the rest of his life with a reverence that bordered on sacred. He never claimed to have invented it. In interviews, rare, honest interviews, he openly credited black artists and black churches as the foundation of everything he did. "The colored folks been singing it and playing it just like I'm doing now, man, for more years than I know," Elvis once said. "I got it from them." That quote doesn't get played on the highlight reels very often, but it tells you something important about what happened in that church. Now, let's be clear about something. This story isn't meant to turn Elvis Presley into a saint. He wasn't one. The music industry in the 1950s was built on exploitation, and Elvis, whether intentionally or not, benefited enormously from a system that kept black artists in the shadows while amplifying white artists who adopted their sound. That's a fact, and no single church visit erases it. But here's what's also true. Elvis Presley grew up inside black music, not as a tourist, not as a thief, but as a child who genuinely, deeply, spiritually loved what he heard. He loved it the way you love something that saves your life, because in many ways it did save his. It saved him from poverty, from silence, from the crushing weight of being nobody in a world that didn't care whether poor white kids from Mississippi lived or died. And when he walked into that black church in Memphis, he wasn't trying to steal anything. He was trying to return to something. The tragedy of Elvis Presley isn't that he took black music. It's that the system around him, the record labels, the managers, the segregated radio stations, the entire architecture of American entertainment, used his white face to sell what black artists had created, while keeping those same black artists locked out of the rooms where the money was counted. Elvis knew this, maybe not fully at first, but over time he understood. And it haunted him. Elvis Presley died in 1977 at the age of 42. By then, the boy who walked into a black church in Memphis trembling with fear and reverence had become something the world couldn't quite categorize. He was a contradiction, a white man with a black sound, a global icon who felt most at home in a place where nobody knew his name. After his death, people found gospel records stacked by his bedside. Worn-out albums by Mahalia Jackson, the Blackwood Brothers, the Statesmen Quartet, Sister Rosetta Tharpe. The music he went to sleep listening to wasn't rock and roll. It was church music. The music that started everything. And maybe that tells us more about Elvis Presley than any biography ever could. That at the end of all of it, the fame, the movies, the pills, the loneliness, the impossible weight of being the most recognized human on earth, he still went back to the sound of that church. Still trying to get home. This story isn't really about Elvis, not entirely. It's about what happens when someone walks into a room where they're not expected, drops every mask they've ever worn, and lets themselves be seen, truly seen, by people who have no reason to offer them grace. And it's about what happens when those people offer it anyway. That's the part that leaves you speechless. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the roots of the music you love, or about the walls we build between each other that music somehow keeps breaking through, then do me a favor. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below telling me what moment hit you the hardest. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel because we tell stories like this every single week. The real stories, the human stories, the ones that remind us we're all a lot more connected than we think. I'll see you in the next one. Watch this video next, the untold story of how one song changed everything.